Welcome to the Burnout Detox Kit Podcast. I'm your host, Sophie. I'm an award-winning people and culture executive, keynote speaker, coach, and the founder of the Burnout Detox Project. Now, for more than a decade, I help companies build high-performing teams and cultures across fast-growing businesses. But behind the scenes, I was burning out over and over again. So I saw the side of success nobody talks about openly. So each week, I bring you raw conversations, expert insights, and honest stories that will help you navigate your toxic workplace, rebuild your confidence, and finally understand what success should never demand from you. So if you press play today, it means some part of you is ready for that to change. Wherever you're listening from, welcome. And let's get into today's episode. Well, welcome, Annabelle. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing. Well, I've been really looking forward to this one. We've worked together on various culture, well-being programs. So you and I know each other way back already. And we collaborated a lot on things really about well-being. So, the best way to introduce you, I guess, is to start with what brought you into the work that you're doing today, your personal connection with the work that you so love in well-being.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for having me. So, where to start? So, I sort of fell into this field. My background is in psychology, entrepreneurial well-being, and founder psychology was not part of that curriculum. It was a relatively emerging field, still is a relatively emerging field. I mean, there's a lot more research now, which I'm sure we'll go into, but that wasn't part of what we were learning. I wasn't really exposed to it at that point. But once I moved on from that, I connected with a entrepreneur, Janos, who is our mutual connection. And he'd had his own lived experiences with the psychological toll of entrepreneurship. And he wanted to build something that sort of raised awareness in the startup ecosystem about that toll, but also how we can build more sustainably and sort of build in support systems and communities for the founders that were out there. So I sort of joined him for that journey. And from there, I took a bit of a deep dive. I spent a lot of time connecting with founders to try and understand their journey, understand the roller coaster, their unique experiences, what they're thinking as they're going through their scaling journeys, what challenges turn up. And then I had the incredible opportunity to connect with a lot of key researchers in this field, people like Dr. Michael Freeman, who I'm sure you've seen his incredibly cited research and statistics around the prevalence of founder mental health and how founders are disproportionately impacted by poor mental health. Also connected with incredible practitioners like Laura, who I think you've had on the podcast before, did some incredible work with people like her, people like Dr. Matthew Jones and Dr. Michael Freeman. So I think I spent a lot of time looking through the lens of these people that had clinical backgrounds and were specifically looking at founder psychology as a very unique population. And then what sort of really drew me in were the kind of paradoxes that we see in entrepreneurship, which I'm sure we'll go into, but it's, I guess, as light touch, it's that we know that entrepreneurship as a function is incredibly important for our social and economic development. And as an occupation, it demands a lot of the individual. You've got to be really clear. You've got to have a lot of drive. You've got to have a lot of clarity in your decision making. You take risks. You're working in really resource constrained environments with a lot of volatility. You've got a lot of kind of identification with your venture, and you need to kind of operate with a lot of clarity. That is all underpinned by a good sort of mental and physical state. Yet the very nature of entrepreneurship as an occupation being very sort of demanding, and also the way in which entrepreneurs are unique and how they relate to their ventures and the self and the venture actually make it incredibly difficult for you to get any sort of distance and have room for prioritizing your recovery and have room for prioritizing your well-being. So I think it was kind of that fundamental tension that I found super, super interesting. And then the kind of cultural influences from an ecosystem perspective that fed into it and added just another layer of complexity around what sort of norms, sort of outdated, I'd say harmful norms and stereotypes that we found in the ecosystem around, founders not necessarily being able to show vulnerability because they're worried about impression management or worried about what their team will think or worried about whether there be any repercussions from like an investor founder perspective. So that sort of added another layer of complexity and another buffer against founders really prioritizing their health and their well-being.
Incredible. I mean, I know even from the first day we met, you've been incredibly excited and passionate about this. Like you said, it's a very novel space to actually spend more time in understanding the psychology behind a founder and their association with what they bring into their ventures. And so therefore, you're really talking about trickling down a lot of these effects into the rest of the business, which most of the time then you kind of like bring in HR to solve the problems, but not really understanding that the root cause of it comes from the founders themselves. So
Mhm.
speaking of founders in this case, founders often believe that they are the problem, right? You've just touched on that really important point there, when in fact they themselves are a product of an unsustainable system that they help build or they're part of, whether they're a new
Mhm.
entry into the ecosystem. So, what psychological patterns do you see in founders who burn out more typically? They tend to have the inability to disassociate themselves from the very identity that they just put into their venture.
Yeah, yeah, super interesting question. I think there's lots of different patterns at play. One that I perhaps think is shows up a lot, especially at the moment with the sort of founders that I've been interacting with, but also that I think is maybe the root cause of a lot of the other challenges. The sort of identity piece and the self and the venture and how founders relate themselves to the venture and where they ground their identity in. And I think with mission driven founders, obviously passion is incredibly central to what they're doing. But that passion can sometimes sort of silently trickle into over identification.
Mm.
So what we sort of talk about around that is the identity fusion. So this idea that I am my business. You probably heard the quote all the time saying to people, you know, you are not your business. And it's that idea of identity fusion because there's so much sort of emotional investment in your venture, because there's so much financial investment, time and energy investment. There's lots of autonomy. There's lots of meaningfulness there. It sort of becomes an extension of you, and you start, you know, seeing yourself and your venture as one identity rather than sort of separate entities. And the issue with that is you start sort of conflating your self-worth with the outcomes of the business, or anything that happens to the business is happening to the self. So if you know you've got a product that the launch fails, or if you get a piece of feedback that's sort of on the whole negative, it feels a bit more like a personal hit, like a personal failure. It's not just something that's happening to the business, it's something that's happening to me. Same on the other side, you've got if something positive happens, you know, it's validation. It can feel like personal validation. But the problem when we're incredibly identified with our ventures, we don't see them as separate entities, is that we start riding the same roller coaster as our business metrics.
Hmm.
So anything that's happening to the business is happening to us, is internalized as personal. And that can lead to a lot of emotional volatility. Sort of you're doing that all the time. And we're not really built to do that. And that emotional volatility is really taxing, you know, psychologically taxing, physically taxing. But most importantly, I think that it has such profound impacts, not just for you personally, but also for your business. So from a personal point of view, you might then it starts trickling down into behavior. So you might have a fear of failure, um, or you might start having quite biased decision making because you're coming from a place of emotional volatility. And for your business, it might look like strategic kind of rigidity, because every decision you make is a reflection of the self, and it's going to have an impact. So you start getting quite rigid in how you sort of make decisions around your business because you're so closely identified with it. But also from a culture perspective, if your business is scaling, um, it's going to have implications for your team and culture. Because if you're so closely identified, if it feels like you're going to be quite protective, you might micromanage, you might struggle with delegation, you might not give people ownership to help you grow the business as much as you'd like to. So I think that's probably one of the biggest patterns I see. And I think I've spoken about this before with a lot of people, and sometimes I get that pushback about, yeah, but it's fine. Like, I'm just passionate. It's just my passion. It's my mission. It's really important to me. And I think that's absolutely fine. It's not about um, caring too much. It's about trying to have that healthy psychological distance between this is a business I'm leading, I'm growing, and it's incredibly important to me. But if it were to go tomorrow, me as a person, I am okay. And it's about not deriving all your self-worth from the achievements or the outcomes of that business. It's about anchoring that self-worth or that sense of self in your other roles in life. You're a parent, you're a avid car enthusiast, your pet owner, whatever else it might be, but it's just not anchoring it all in your business because you start riding that roller coaster. And it's something that I've been thinking about recently, which I'd be quite interested to get your views on, is the role that personal branding might be playing in this relationship. Because, recently I found myself talking to founders about the importance of personal branding as sort of a part of your marketing strategy, because it builds a lot of trust, it builds a lot of visibility. But what risk is that playing in further weaving your sort of sense of self into your business? And how can we mitigate that risk? Are we starting to use engagement as a proxy for our self-worth? If it's doing well online from a personal branding or engagement perspective, is that validation? And if we're not getting that, is that again rejection? So yeah, I've just been thinking about how personal branding maybe relates to that.
I think you're right. I mean, if you're really talking about personal branding, I guess we're just moving from one thing to another, isn't it? We're moving our association of the personal identity heavily infused with the venture and now moving those business metrics over to engagement metrics, because you're absolutely right. The way that you're saying it is, as a founder coach myself, I have met founders who things that they require validation, which is totally fine. It's part of how they believe their business is going to be successful, because it's about themselves, it's about the brand, and because they have kind of like given birth to the brand and the product and the idea and the mission all together. It's very difficult. I know what you're saying here, that sometimes it's not going to be very conducive when you have two of these deeply, these identities deeply intertwined, but at the same time, it's also quite difficult to tear yourself away from it, because it's probably the only thing that kind of fills up your day. All the activities that you're doing is directly related to that particular, mission. And so therefore it's the entirety of your personality. Let's put it that way, right?
Mm,
How often have we met people who they're a founder, they have a business, whether successful or not, whatever stage they're in, they go out and the first thing they introduce themselves as is the founder of that business.
mm,
That is the entirety of the starting conversation. So hear what you're saying, Annabelle, but I also think it's very, very hard to tear yourself away
yeah.
from it when you put so much effort. Like you said, it's not just the investment, it's probably the only thing they think about as they go
Mm,
to
mm,
sleep and they wake up in the morning, and it completely dictates how they run their day.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, I think it is incredibly difficult, and I don't think it's to say that you should have them completely separate, because I just don't think that's a reality. But it's about finding that, and I know I keep saying, but finding that psychological distance where you can look at your business from a little bit more of an objective or maybe observer or third person lens, so you can make better decisions. If you're completely intertwined and enmeshed from sort of a self-worth and emotions perspective, you're going to find it harder to lead in that way. And I think that's a really fine line, and it's incredibly hard to balance. The various techniques and ways that we can do that. But yeah, I completely hear you.
Yeah. So let's talk about, founders doing that. I guess when you are one and one only, or when you belong to a small team in the early stage of your company, it's probably easier to kind of make it. Let's put it this way. When you're smaller, it's more reasonable that your entire personality and identity is intertwined into your business. Totally okay. I guess you need to come to a point where it's now too big for it to just be about me. This is
Mm,
where a lot of founders kind of fall into this area, this gray area where they're still growing. There is a lot of compassion on them in terms of how much they're taking on. But it does get to a point where they keep delaying the help until they're completely depleted. Now, part
yeah.
of the story we want to talk about today is how founders get themselves into burnout, and most of the
Mm.
time not even realizing that it's happening to them, right? So in your experience, what's actually going on beneath that? Why do they wait until it's so late before they seek out for help?
Yeah, I think it's a myriad of reasons, really. And I think what we found is a lot of the founders that were receptive to what we were doing or, open to receiving support were either founders who had reached crisis point before and decided that this was something they wanted to invest in, or second time founders who had a challenge the first time and wanted to build more sustainably. So we definitely do see that lag in action in terms of asking for support or prioritizing well-being. I think it's a mixture of reasons. I think if we look at the top first startup ecosystem, a bit about what I mentioned at the beginning around the norms and the culture we find. I mean, I don't know how you feel about how that's maybe shifting. I do think we've seen a bit of a shift in terms of how we view well-being in the entrepreneurial journey. But I think that's one thing that sort of acts as a bit of a barrier, because if you sort of subscribe to those strong founder stereotype norms and you can't show vulnerability, and that's not what a leader is. And it's complete devotion to the cause. And that comes in the form of super long hours, high intensity, never breaking, you know, running through walls. I think that can sort of stop you, because that also leads into the impression management. So you've got your customers to worry about what they think of you. You've got your team to worry about. You've got potentially investors, and I think that's an even more complex relationship, because you've got an investment and a transaction and a need to perform there. But a lot of founders are constantly worrying about, if they were to be a little bit more vulnerable about challenges, whether that would impact any of those stakeholders and what impressions they have and what confidence they have in them to lead and bring the venture to fruition. So I think that's another piece. But I also think that burnout, it's not of a gradual process. It's this accumulation of stress over time. And stress is not the enemy. I think it's stress is unmanaged, or when we don't have recovery worked in, that's when it becomes a problem. Because, positive stress is super important for entrepreneurial drive, for helping us to kind of get through the hard moments, for kind of underpinning resilience, and especially for mission driven founders. But if that is sustained over time, if that becomes the default, this sort of stress, it can become distress, it can become chronic stress, and that has huge impacts for our mental and physical health and our ability to lead. But it can creep up on you. It doesn't knock on the door and sort of tell you it's coming. It's kind of this slow accumulation of things. And I also think we sort of see a lot of high functioning burnout or functional burnout, where you might outwardly be performing really well. The business might be performing great. You might be hitting all your targets. You're showing up every day. People are validating, saying what you're doing is great, that things are going great. Underneath, you're exhausted, or you're sort of disengaged, demotivated, having cynicism, having feelings of wanting to run away. But these are quite sort of quiet in comparison to how you're doing outwardly. And I think you don't necessarily realize in these conditions that you're burning out until you hit a tipping point or a critical mass, and it all sort of comes out in the wash then. So I think it's a combination of different factors.
So let's talk about, you're absolutely right, because I think there is a lot of misaligned expectations when it comes to burnout. We think that it's physical. It's meant to wipe you out and really forcefully take you out of the equation, and you finally give it a name and you call it a burnout. But like you said, it's a lot of unsurmountable stress that has been added on over time, and eventually it becomes unsustainable, and you actually have nowhere else to escape but to explode. So this is effectively is what a lot of founders have said that they have to go through, until one day it just kind of hit you like a ton of bricks. But then if you've had some downtime to go and do some reflection, you realize, oh, hold on, I've
Yeah.
actually been, taking this on far longer than I should have allowed myself to. But hey,
Yeah.
hindsight is
Yeah. Hindsight is a great thing.
Yeah. So talking about culture, and I know you and I are both very passionate about culture as a consequence when it comes to founders who are not really taking care of themselves, as well as, basically putting their whole well-being and mental health at the very bottom of their own personal agenda. So
Mm.
let's talk about the culture that mirrors the leader. In my experience, I have clearly seen that you can't build a psychologically safe company or environment if you yourself, as a leader, are not mentally safe, right?
Mm.
So, what happens when the founder becomes the cultural bottleneck then? But most of the time, they don't even know it. Maybe other people around them have seen the signs, but they continue to push on through for whatever reasons they are. People wanting to keep their jobs, people are still really brought into, their passion and their mission about the company. And so all of this becomes really enabling. What do we do when the founder becomes the very bottleneck?
Yeah, I think what you said that was quite important around it's not with intent. You don't go out to build a toxic culture or an unhealthy culture or an unsustainable culture. I think we've seen a lot of founders struggle to transition from their own role transition, so from a founder into maybe a CEO, where the role is that you're managing people and make people sort of perform at their best. So you have to go a sort of large role change yourself that people struggle with. But I think one of the main things is that culture isn't static and it evolves. And what worked at a very sort of early level when it was very founder centric, um, when the sort of norms and values are an extension of the founder and their working practices, and it's maybe you and your co-founder and a few other people, it is not going to scale without intentionally looking at it and checking it and temperature checking and making adjustments. So what worked for a team of 5 isn't going to work for a team of 50. And we sort of have to, although a lot of culture, I think, happens organically, a lot of it needs to be intentional and it can't go unchecked, especially when you are scaling. Because every time you add a new team member, that's a whole nother piece of diversity of thought. People bring their own unique ways of working and values and beliefs. Of course, obviously you hire to try and align sort of values and mission. But yeah, just to be mindful that it's not something that you can just leave to sort of build by itself. And I think as you scale, I mean, we were talking about over identification earlier. That's something you have to be really mindful on because it's not going to be sustainable to have a scaling organization that is overly dependent on the founder. If all decisions, all ideas, all behaviors, everything sort of circulates around the founder and has to funnel through or from the founder, that's not going to be helpful both from an operational perspective in terms of slowing down decisions and not having sort of shared ownership and delegation and helping with that, but also from a cultural perspective because people feel undervalued. They don't feel like they have an influence. They don't feel sort of psychologically safe to, put their 2p in and share their perspectives and their ideas. So yeah, I think it's just being very mindful that whilst culture starts with you as a founder in the very early days, that it develops and you have to sort of keep an eye on it and temperature check it and litmus test it. But I think speaking to someone recently about how the fear of getting something wrong often stops you from even trying in the first place. And I feel like that is so true with culture. And for me, it's not the antidote isn't perfection. It's kind of, I mean, two things. It's about transparency and honesty and also sort of shared ownership. So um, I think when you're firefighting, it's really easy to deprioritize culture and kind of get fearful of addressing it, but this is probably when it's needed most. But just being honest about, listen, we're building a culture here. This is what I'm working on. I need all of your input. I'd like to have sort of co-ownership of building this culture. What are we getting wrong? What are we getting right? What should we do? What do we need? And I think just owning it in that way helps to take the pressure off the founder, um, but also sort of brings everyone else in for the journey and helps that culture scale. But you're sort of the culture person, so I wonder if you think differently.
No, I think that's actually true. I would say though it's probably it's a lot less scalable when founders put put intention into the culture that they are planning to grow or let them evolve. But I think it's, it's one of those things that it's easier said than done, because you're right, because there's definitely that fear of getting it wrong that actually stops you from doing anything about it, right? Because there's only that many books you can read about culture before you can kind of go, this is the type of leader I want to be. And so therefore, this is the type of ecosystem and environment I want to create. I don't necessarily think that I've met any founder who's particularly gotten them right, down to the T. But I do think that I have seen enough of the effort that goes in. And one of the things that is the most remarkable I've seen in founders is their ability to be acutely aware when things are not going so well and immediately addressing them. I think it's really important to show that behavior of confronting when it's painful, where it's painful, and then work together to get through it. I think, in my personal opinion, those are some of the best founders I've worked with, because, running a business means that you're going to most of the time have longer hard times than you do have the good times, right? Especially in a startup space where both you and I operate in. And being able to create, I'm not saying the vulnerability, but being able to create the space where people can come together and champion some hard times, including cultural breakdowns. Those are some of those incredible moments that you will see great leaders really step up to the plate.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that was the whole point around sort of pattern avoidance and sort of shoving things under the rug or in the basement, and hoping that in the long term that they don't sort of show their face again. So
Yeah. Well, you have said that well-being isn't obviously always baked into part of the business. I mean, let's be honest, well-being is hardly even a word that you use in your business strategy. It's mostly commercial, it's mostly product, it's also mostly how much more money you can make on the product that you are creating that is meant to save the world, right?
yeah,
Period. But we know for a fact that well-being really matters, not just in the work that you do, Annabelle, but it's also really important that you've seen how great leaders can create performance cultures based on the fact that they do care about well-being and mental health. Yet it is still very much treated as a personal responsibility. Now, this is my personal beef with this whole conversation around how it's either a H job or, it's a responsibility of your people team, or it's a responsibility of specific people who are dedicated to look after the well-being of others. But at the same time, we would walk away, shut our laptops, and then we go back to our personal lives and we go, well, actually, well-being is my own responsibility. So it kind of feels like there's a fine line here that we can't quite establish. So why do you think there's this huge absence still when it comes to well-being in leadership?
I think a lot of it comes from we have to assess what our individual understandings or beliefs, I should say, around performance and well-being are. Do you see well-being as a performance tool, someone that's going to help you steer something that's going to help you steer the ship, help you get from A to B, or do you see it more as something that can be deprioritized? It's a nice to have, it's a luxury. And I think it all starts from assessing what our understanding of well-being and performance is. And I think for me, I always come back to the fact that performance isn't a simple input and output view. And especially within entrepreneurship, I think it's not just about the time and energy you put in. Obviously, entrepreneurship has got the longest working hours of any occupation. A lot of that is because the more time you spend, the more you get done, which is true. But there is a certain point where we go beyond our productive capacity from a biology perspective. But I think, performance is not just about time and energy, it's about our capacity. It's our capacity to make decisions. It's our capacity to think creatively. It's our capacity to, not be reactive and make good decisions. Our capacity to lead well, think clearly, all of these things. And that all is underpinned by paying attention to our well-being, and how we're looking after ourselves and our mind, and making sure that we're cycling our effort as well as our recovery as well.
So you're talking about performance is directly related to our capacity to do a lot of these very performance-driven outputs, right? And I think most founders don't realize that, which is probably one of the reasons why they put well-being at the bottom of the rank and expect someone else to fix it. For instance, like I said, most of the conversations I've had is with the HR team to fix it. It's a problem when it becomes a problem, and then you hire someone to kind of fix the problem that you've created yourself. Let's put it this way. So in your experience, Annabelle, when you've seen good like founders work on well-being because they care about it, not just because from their own personal perspective they've gone through burnout, so now therefore it's a more touchy topic right now and they care about it more, but how can founders build cultures that actually support both performance and well-being?
Yeah.
What's their role in this?
Yeah. I think in most scaling startups, HR or an HR person or an HR department is one of the last things to come in and to be hired. And I don't think that you can wait for, like you said, HR to come and fix your culture or to build your culture. The roots would have been sort of growing long, long before that. So a few things I think that entrepreneurs can do and how they can contribute to that. I think one is really examining your assumptions and your beliefs around performance and well-being and how that contributes to your scaling company and your venture success. Do you see it as a performance tool or do you see it as a nice to have? Is it a strategic lever for you, or is it just something that you imagine as, I'll pay attention to well-being once we've hit X, Y, Z target? So really examining what your beliefs around performance and well-being is. And I think from a culture perspective, something that I think is important is to start thinking about it from day dot. So start your kind of culture design at the same time as your business plan. So sometimes even defining sort of a culture document. Obviously, we've talked about how it evolves and how you have to be flexible as you scale. But I think at the beginning, defining not just a statement of your values, but sort of how you want the environment around your business to be, what actions and behaviors you want to sort of reward, how you want to deal with conflict, how you want to make decisions, what you want to prioritize, and how you want to be vocal about your views around sustainable performance. And then a bit of a system for revisiting and checking in on this as you go. So I think it's quite important to start defining that from day dot and not just wait for HR to come in at whatever part of your scale that would be. I also think talking and being quite vocal, explicit about your understanding or your views on how well-being plays a role in performance and how it should be baked into your business. So as a founder, being very explicit about how you see recovery as a means to support productivity, to support performance, as a way for you to realize your vision and get the potential out of all your team members, and just being quite vocal about that. It's not giving people permission, but I think it's always easier to feel okay doing something from a team perspective if you see that behavior modeled from the founder. And I think probably one of the biggest things for me, and maybe one of the perks I have around kind of well-being in the workplace, is that it's, building well-being into systems rather than just perks. And I think a lot of the challenges, a lot of the discomfort, a lot of the time when culture starts to take shape comes a lot from the sort of basics of organizational design and for fulfilling basic needs in terms of having clear roles, having clear expectations, having physical sustainability, so making sure caseloads are not unsustainable, and also financial security and financial sustainability. So people know, they're being paid fairly, people know what their progression opportunities are, they see a future with the business. I think getting those systemic drivers right has a huge impact, and you can't just, this is addressing the root cause, not just the symptoms. Obviously all of the well-being initiatives and perks that you can get are brilliant, but you need to get the kind of the organizational design right as well.
So many of us grew up with the equation of pressure versus purpose. And most of the time, it equates to the same. It means success. everything else in the middle, everything else in between are all weaknesses. That's why we push it down. We keep pushing it down because we don't want to address those kind of conversations, because most of the time we don't even have an answer across, right? But when founders are trying to write new scripts nowadays, as you have said, it feels really optimistic that we're seeing more and more founders, entrepreneurs that care more about their well-being, they're paying more attention to their mental health. And so therefore, we are only optimistic about the fact that this is going down the right route, right? How do we, fundamentally help them decouple stress from achievement? Because we can have all of these toolkits around us, and we can have all of these frameworks that we've learned from other failures to bring it into success in today's day and age. But if we can't decouple that identity, that everything stressful equates to achievement, then where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, sort of decoupling that identity and achievement piece so that it doesn't impact our self-worth and our confidence. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it all starts with self-awareness, as most of these things do, but noticing how you speak about yourself and yourself in relation to the venture. Do you very much sort of conflate them as one entity, but also how you speak to yourself? I'm a failure. This product didn't launch. We've had a bad month of sales, whatever it might be. How are you speaking to yourself in those moments? I think so. Starting with that self-awareness is incredibly important, especially around, are you riding that emotional roller coaster that we spoke about in terms of your business metrics? How much is every single twist and turn impacting you as a person? I think that's a good place to start. Then other sort of techniques, I think there's a lot of different ones. I think self-distancing is one that I've seen a lot of founders sort of practice, and that can be as simple as the language you use. So start referring to the business as, you know, what does the business need, or what does company X need, rather than what do I need to do. And it's also about distancing in the sense of you can look at it from a observer lens or a third party person. Say you're facing a challenge within your business, would X person, maybe a mentor or someone else, what would they do in the situation? What would they think in that situation? And that's a form of social distancing. Or zooming out and getting a bit more perspective and say, what role does this play in the long term, or is this going to be as important? Sorry, I don't know if you had that. Is this going to be down the line? So getting some more sort of temporal distance. So that's one thing people focus on, is that self-distancing, especially around viewing setbacks as data points rather than as personal failures or anything personal, I suppose. And that helps you to learn, because if you view it, instead of saying, I failed at this, if it's this didn't work, you're using that as an opportunity to learn. It's just a data point. You're taking that kind of personal emotion out of it. So I think that's one way we can look at it from a self-distancing perspective. Another thing is sort of identity and buffer zones. I mean, we know that entrepreneurship is called boundaryless work. It seeps into work and non-work life. They sort of blend. And one way in which we can try and start decoupling ourselves from the venture, and then therefore kind of self-worth from achievement, is to really be quite disciplined about where we enforce some boundaries. So that might be physical sort of time and space boundaries, whether that be you work for certain hours, or whether that be you don't check emails in the evening and you really protect your family time, and making sure that those boundaries are vocalized to the people around you, whether that be your investors or your team. You set that expectations about your needs for recovery, and that's absolutely okay. And it's a productive part, and that's what people should view it as. Boundaries and identity buffering. There's also values-based identity anchoring, which is where we try to base our sense of self and our identity within our values rather than within outcomes, because your values are a lot more stable, they're core to you, whereas your business outcomes are going to come and go. They're going to fluctuate a lot. And that means that, you've got your identity beyond the business. Like we said, you're a parent, you're a whatever else you might be. So basing it in your values, and therefore what that does is you start to define success and your sort of deride your self-worth in the way that you show up. So rather than in the, how your business is performing, how have you shown up? So for example, you had to have a really tough conversation that you didn't want to have. It's a really tricky time for you in the business, but I showed up with integrity. I had the tough conversation and I've just moved myself one step closer. So it's sort of tying it to how you show up and your core values more so than the kind of more like tangible sort of business outcomes and metrics. Oh, there's so many. I guess just one more then. One of my personal favorites is sort of around mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy. Well, it's derived from acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's this sort of idea that we're all going to have negative thoughts and ruminate and things that pop up all the time. Um, but the core of ACT is around psychological flexibility. So this idea that we can have negative thoughts and hold them and notice them without them sort of controlling us and taking over our sort of behavior. It's this idea that you can still make progress, you can still kind of think clearly whilst doubt and fear are still in the room with you. So a few ways in which we do this is just starting to notice those thoughts and behaviors. So instead of I'm a failure or I didn't do very well during X meeting, it's I'm having the thought that, and that is a very subtle shift, but it just creates a little bit more distance. Um, and it's also about letting ourselves sit with discomfort and, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. You hear that a lot in the kind of entrepreneurial realm, but it's that idea that you can have a negative thought without letting it control you. You don't need to fix it immediately as it comes in. You don't need to numb it. You don't need to try and bury it. It can just sit there. At the end of the day, it's another emotion. So if you just notice it, name it, let it sit there, you can sort of move on. And then I think part of that comes with pausing and not reacting when those thoughts comes in. Don't immediately go to react. Give yourself a little bit of time, have that little distance between it, notice the thought, name it, then have a kind of intentional response to it. So I sort of zoomed through a few there, but there are different things that we can start to look at and practice to try and decouple our sense of self or our self-worth from the business, or from, I should say, outcomes. And yeah, definitely things we can do.
Sounds like quite a bit there that we
Yes.
can, we're definitely not exhausted of resources, is what you're really saying here, Annabelle, right? Because the reality is we often get ourselves in a position where we think, oh my God, all of these things are happening to me. I don't even know how to start to get myself out of this rut. But actually, there are resources. There are many, many kind of like tips, tools, tricks, whatever you call it. There are people who have gone through very similar journeys, and it's proven, right? So I think you get really fearful when you get caught up with it. And so you suddenly think that I don't know what to do with myself. So the only thing to do then is to keep going with the familiar. And so therefore you kind of get yourself further and further down the line where you eventually burn out, like we said. There was something that you mentioned earlier, which was also really important. And I want to come back to this around recovery. Now, as you know, and as you've said, entrepreneurs tend to just keep going until a certain point, and even if they break, they still keep going because there's a certain persona they need to be carrying on for the sake of the business, for the sake of their product, or for their people too, right? There's a lot to show up for. Resting is also a way of being productive. We shouldn't be avoiding rest and recovery because we know it's important. We actually need to be intentionally adapting that into our day to day, but I still don't see enough leaders do it.
Yeah, I think it comes back to examining our assumptions about well-being and about performance, especially in an entrepreneurial context. I think a lot of the work that I did and I do is about shifting that mindset to they're not mutually exclusive. Well-being is not in one corner, and performance and success with your ventures not in the other corner. Actually, they positively reinforce each other, and we need to start viewing it like that. All the we know how demanding entrepreneurship is. We know that it takes a lot of psychological and physiological resources. We expend a lot of that doing it. We have to, have a lot of mental acuity, think clearly, make rapid decisions under a lot of pressure. So we have to, essentially you have to be on your A game. And what underpins that? That's, thinking clearly, feeling good. It's your physical and your mental state. So investing that is strategic. It is investing in the performance of yourself, but also your ability to lead and your ability to bring your venture to fruition. And I think it also depends on your short-term and long-term view. I think the best founders, or the founders that sort of appreciate a relationship between well-being and performance in their venture, are often those that take a little bit more of a long-term view. So yes, that hustle mentality might serve you really well in the beginning. There's no doubt that you need to work really hard to, get things off the ground. But you have to consider a couple things. One, is that going to be sustainable in the long run? Is that going to be sustainable when we scale, when we get more people, when the organization comes a little bit more bureaucratic or hierarchical? Is that culture or that hustle mentality still going to serve then? Two, what are you going to lose? What's the opportunity cost? What are you going to lose in the process? Are you going to potentially turn to kind of maladaptive coping mechanisms? Is it going to have an impact on your team and culture? So I think it's just starting to unpack how you view it, and yeah, ultimately trying to shift your mindset to one that values the cycling of effort and recovery as a strategic move and as part of your strategy, rather than at odds with each other, because they're absolutely not. But that's the recovery paradox, isn't it? The people that need recovery the most, they find it the most elusive, as Dr. Ute Stefan and the research. But yeah, so I think it's just trying to start shifting that mindset, and yeah, maybe having a look through someone else's lens, maybe
Mm.
zooming out. I think obviously we all have our own schemas and our ways of viewing the world, and the reason why you start a business and the emotional investment and the intensity that you go at it with your mission is going to be different than the people that sort of join you for the journey. But so maybe trying to come out of your lens for a moment and have a look about, what does the business need, what do the team need? We've got such diversity of ways of working, of reasons why people are joining you for the mission, and just sort of appreciating that and trying to get a little bit more perspective beyond your view, because you're so emotionally and, well, you're invested in every way.
That's very well said. It's particularly that last point that you made just now around, if all fails, look at
Mm,
from someone else's lens. But surely there's a different way. I think being curious, staying open-minded is going to be really helpful for a lot of the founders that kind of feel like, you know, because it's often quite daunting to think, I need a completely mindset shift. Like, what does that look like? Is it changing habits? Is it particularly changing my discipline model, or changing the way I take over my day to day? But actually, it's just one small step at a time. And I think we often tends to think that it's a much bigger step that we need to take all at once than it is the small steps.
yeah, yeah, and it's not all or nothing. I think that's where a lot of people become their own bottleneck. I mean, I'm like it myself. I sort of go at something, and if it's not done 100%, then I sort of don't want to continue. But yeah, I think it's not all or nothing. It's incremental. Take whatever small steps you can to implement recovery into your entrepreneurial life, and see what it benefits. A/B test it, see what works for you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Annabelle, one final question I must ask. You have supported so many entrepreneurs in your career now, and you're still very passionate about it. That's one thing we've learned. What is the one thing you've learned that still surprises you until today?
Good question. I'd say not necessarily something that surprises me, but something I think is really important to sort of speak about and be a little bit more vocal about, is that, we talk about burnout and entrepreneurship, and we talk about it sometimes in a way where it seems almost like entrepreneurship is very, very conducive to burnout, and it's almost like a badge of honor or a rite of passage that you're going to have to go down. But actually, what we know is that entrepreneurship has a lot of protective advantages compared to other sort of occupations, because a lot of the drivers of burnout that we tend to see around, low autonomy or lack of control or misalignment of values, we don't necessarily see them as severely in entrepreneurship. A lot of entrepreneurs derive a lot of meaning from their business. It's very meaningful work. They have a lot of autonomy. They have a lot of control. They're operating in line with their values, and those can sort of offset burnout risk, using their autonomy and their control to put healthy boundaries in and to prioritize recovery and well-being as part of the process. Then actually we can start to mitigate burnout a lot more than we realize. Not negative in the way that we speak about burnout and entrepreneurship, but it is a huge sort of weight. And I just think it's interesting to talk about how actually a lot of entrepreneurship is very personally enriching and professionally enriching, and there's a lot of protective advantages there as well if we lean into them.
Most of the people who go through burnout, it's because of the lack of autonomy, the lack of alignment with their own principles and values. Like you said, there's not enough anchoring that actually makes them believe that this journey that they're on is actually even worth it. Many other occupations go through burnout because it's a numb and mindless journey that they go through. Eventually, it doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs that I've spoken to don't really resonate with the sort of balance side of things, so the work-life balance, because a lot of that indicates a very strong 50-50 split, when in actual fact, it's very much blended in terms of work and life from an entrepreneurial perspective. So sometimes I like to think of it more as work-life rhythm. So learning how to sort of flow and ebb and flow with effort and recovery in a way that really allows you to sustain for the long run.
Your experience has been obviously very, very valuable to share some of these learnings.
Interesting one. I think firstly, familiarize yourself with the symptoms of burnout. Like we said, it's a gradual process. If you can start to understand when maybe you're a bit depleted and act early, that's always much better. And I think hand in hand with that, don't delay. It's a bit of a moving target, and pressure rarely sort of eases up. It's quite important. So I think it's quite nice to have an accountability partner. So that might be your co-founder, it could be a mentor, it could be a partner, it could be someone in your team, just somebody that you have structured check-ins with. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
You've been really great at naming the invisible patterns, I would call them, right? The hidden shame, the hope that it's possible when founders kind of like pause long enough for them to reflect, although we know that that's an ideal situation we all hope for founders. You've also reminded us that leadership doesn't have to cost our health, and culture doesn't have to be the mirror of every chaos that we bring into the business. I mean, I particularly love what you said about how at the end of the day, the culture that we create is basically a cascade or a consequence of how we didn't give ourselves enough capacity to do better decision making, right? Or to take charge of the situation that needs to be a lot more sustainable. So I have enjoyed our conversation so much. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom, and I cannot wait to see what you go on and do next.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been so nice.
If this episode resonated with you today, make sure to follow and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a conversation as important as this. The Burnout Detox Kit is here to make sure ambitious people like you recover from the burnout without losing themselves in the process. So if you know someone navigating burnout right now, workplace toxicity, even simply trying to hold it all together, share this episode with them. You never know who might need to hear it. I thank you for your courage today, and thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next episode.